Let me thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts. I will not deliver paper in the typical sense where people have PowerPoint presentations and all those traditional things. I'd rather share my thoughts with you in the hope and the belief that when those thoughts are received by the panelists, they'll then unpack them and deal with them in a manner that will speak to the subject and the overall theme, which is digital innovation and the future of journalism. Of course, you've given it a twist by asking me to talk about the preparedness for the 21st century, which is now in its second decade. Let me preface my presentation by saying that one of the problems we have in Africa, particularly those of us who have gone to school, and those schools are schools which equip us with Western tools of analysis, we are handicapped in many ways, because in many ways our thought processes are also captured unless you consciously make a decision to liberate yourself and use the information as tools of mental and intellectual liberation. So that if you typically asked your Kenyan intellectual, he or she would tell you that the journalists are the fourth estate. And if you ask them why they are called the fourth estate, they'll take you to Edmund Burke and say that Edmund Burke, sitting in the House of Commons, looked at the king, looked at the clergy, looked at the commoners, and looked at the press gallery and said, and yonder sits the fourth estate and the greatest of them all. Very interesting, because we try to attribute our intellectual prowess by citing what are essentially feudalistic colonial structures. And typically, therefore, when your African journalist wants to report or to have an authentic, in their view, source of information, they would go to Associated Press, they would go to Agence France, they would go to Deutsche Welle, they would go to BBC, and lately they would go to Xinhua, and they would go to CGTN, and they would go to Al Jazeera. I'm submitting to you that the African journalist, like the African intellectual, is a mental slave of articulations and theories that are alien to her. Truth be told, even if you are to look at the newspapers in Tanzania today, or in Kenya today, or in Uganda today, or in Burundi today, and you ask the source of the news, it is all conceived and packaged elsewhere, and our newspapers are merely medias of transition. Many times I look at these newspapers, particularly the sports section, word for word. It is what has happened in Paris, what has happened in Italy, what has happened in the United Kingdom, and you go to the international pages, what has happened as reported by Xinhua or AFP, which begs the question, and the famous Kenyan journalist Hilary Ngweno once posed the question, is an African journalist truly a journalist? If journalist is therefore defined to mean individuals who receive news and package it in a particular way for the sake of consumption in a manner that is sensitive to the environment and in a manner that is sensitive to the culture and the tradition of the people amongst whom the report is being undertaken. And if you look once again at many of the newspapers in many parts of Africa, they are owned either partially or otherwise by agencies which are not African. And these are very critical issues that we've got to take into account. We now know that the print media, as we know it, is seeing, if you may, its last days because of the intervention of digital innovation. But even when we talk about digital innovation, tell me, and I want you who are in the panelists to tell the audience that is listening, which of the media which we use so gleefully is African? None of them. So that if you are talking about use of Instagram, you are talking about the Facebook, you are talking about any of those media, if the proprietors of those media sitting in Europe or America chose to shut them down, you would be shut down. That is the reality. In other words, it is like milking a borrowed cow. The owner can take it anytime. And that is the space in which we find ourselves. We are lulled into a false sense of security, and we think Facebook is ours. We think Instagram is ours. We think all these media is ours. So it is actually remiss on our part to talk about digital evolution in an African context because there is no such innovation. What is happening is that we are piggy banking on what is happening in Europe and America and in China, and we can be shut down at any minute. You will agree with me that the Chinese can talk about digital innovation because they have their own Weibo, they have their own media, so that if the Western world chose to shut them down, they would still have something to ride on, but not for the African journalist. How many times, those of you who are present in this assembly, have you posted something either via Twitter or Facebook, and unknown to you, somebody who sits in a place that you do not know thinks that it is not worthy and removes it, and you can no longer access it? That is how powerless you are in this particular environment. And I'm telling us, particularly those of us who have gone to school, because we think we are clever. We are not. We just think we are clever. We have these degrees, we have these professorships, and the truth is that we are as handicapped as our kins who did not go to school, because we do not innovate, we do not invent, we consume what is produced by other civilizations, and when you do that, you are in a very weak position. Be that as it may, the reality is that this is the era of knowledge. I remember in 1979, the Organization of African Unity created the Pan-African News Agency, headquarters in Dakar in Senegal. The idea then was that you can no longer allow information that is coming out of Africa to be packaged for you by foreign news agencies. But several years down the line, the Pan-African News Agency is as good as in a state of suspended animation. If you go to many African countries and you watch their television, beyond a certain hour, you will see them airing programs which are made by Radio Deutsche Welle in China. You'll see them airing programs that are made by French television. You see them airing programs that are made by CNN, or you see them airing programs that are made by Al Jazeera. In other words, your typical African news media is essentially dependent on foreign media, which begs the question, therefore, what are we to do going forward? How are we to train our journalists? How are we to ensure that we are present in the space of news gathering and news dissemination in a manner that will be useful to the continent of Africa? And let me give you a number of things that are very critical now. We now know, for example, that there are conflicts in Africa. There are conflicts in, there is conflict in northern Mozambique. There is conflict in Eastern Congo, there is conflict in the Cameroon, there is conflict in the Sahel. Do you ever hear any Pan-African news agency reporting them? We are at the mercy of Al Jazeera or CNN, and whichever spin they give them, that is the spin that we accept. And an African journalist celebrates when he or she is appointed to be a news anchor for CNN, when he or she is appointed to be a news anchor for Radio Deutsche Welle, when he or she is appointed to be a news anchor for BBC, that is when they celebrate. You will never hear them celebrate that I've been appointed, I'm a Kenyan, I'm appointed by Azam Television or by Radio Rwanda. No, they celebrate that which is foreign. But if we are going forward, you remember the age-old story that until the day that the lions have their own historians, there is exploits of the hunter that will be written about rather than the bravery and courage of the lion. I'm submitting to this audience. If Africa is to play her rightful role in this century, which, as I've already said, is in its second decade, the African journalist must style up. The African journalist must do what Yuat Thiong'o said in another setting, decolonize his or her mind. The African journalist must be a journalist who is trained, as Diosagiefo Kwame Nkrumah used to say in 1963, he must be culturally aware. He must be an individual who understands the value of education that is coming to our community. He must be an individual who understands the areas in which Africa ought to innovate and invent. He must be an individual, if he's a medical correspondent, who understands the terrain of Africa. He must be an individual who, when he or she reports about climate, is capable of understanding the nuances of Africa. He must be an individual who understands the cultural dynamics in Africa. He must be an individual who, in a manner of speaking, understands Africa in her diversity, which then suggests to me that that kind of individual must be one who, although he is trained to understand the rest of the world, he or she is also trained in a manner that makes him or her Afrocentric in his or her understanding of things that are African. And what is Afrocentric? Afrocentric, from my interpretation, must be understood to mean that he is an individual who recognizes that there are certain specificities and particularities which are African, which can only be understood by understanding the culture and dynamics of the continent. He must be an individual who, while being a warrior for truth and justice, knows that truth must be handled in a manner that is beneficial to the set agenda. He must be an individual. He must be an individual who has liberated himself or herself from the belief that everything African is inferior and everything European or progressively Chinese is superior. That is the kind of journalist that we are talking about. He must be a journalist who, when he or she is reporting about democracy, must not tell us that democracy was defined by some unknown Englishman, or the democracy was defined by Abraham Lincoln. He must be aware of our men and women who define democracy and who appreciate that democracy is not a one-size-fits-all prescription from Washington, Spain, Paris, or London. He must be an individual who, when he is reporting, as I've already said, about the science, is able to appreciate and understand what is happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo. He or she must be a specialist who is giving the audience not just sound bites, but analytical rendition of things that he or she has deliberately decided to deal with. That is the journalist that we are going to talk about. And that journalist is in a very unique space because today the reader is not relying on the print media. If you ask many proprietors of the print media in many African countries, if they sell 20,000 copies of their editions in a week, they are doing very well. Down from 100,000, down from 150. Today, what we call breaking news, which we see on television, is news that possibly was reported by bloggers or other media active, other internet active individuals earlier than the newspapers ever thought about it. Today, as we sit here, you can watch almost blow by blow the conflict that is going on between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza. That is how instantaneous news is. In other words, the new journalist must be a journalist who is supported by an infrastructure which is capable of responding to the realities of the day. The tragedy, however, is that the new journalist is competing with individuals who, armed with half-truths, untruths, and abject false lies, is going around the media stations several times before you come with the truth, so that the truth is in many times drowned in a sea of misinformation, disinformation, and half-truths. How are we going to deal with that? Going forward, one of the things that African countries must do is to begin to think of creating new platforms which are not susceptible to manipulation by foreign countries. We must, in the nature of things, create our own platforms. We must aim to have our own equivalent of Facebook. We must aim to have our own equivalent of Twitter. We must struggle to have our own equivalent of Instagram. We must do that, because if we don't, we can be shut out at any moment, as we have seen it being done. If they could do it in the United States of America to their former president, the people called Twitter and Facebook, why should they do it to you here in Africa? So these are the issues that are on the table. Unfortunately, I'm speaking at a time where the digital space has made us very lazy. Today, out of 10 people, if you ask them the last book they read, perhaps 7 have never read a book from page 1 to the last page, because it is all so easy. It is coming in sound bites. It is coming in these news alerts, and you think you know it. And you see, as Alexander Pope once said, a little modernity is a dangerous thing. Drink deep the Western spring or taste not. And I'm suggesting to us that if we want to take and partake of the things of the 21st century, we must be equipped with the tools of the 21st century. And this space requires that our training must be different. You know, sometimes I see how journalists are still trained in many African universities. They are still trained like they were trained in the 1960s with chalk and board. How can you possibly compete? We've got to change all this. Even your newsroom must change. Even the most modern newsroom in many African countries is still primitive, if you allow me to use that word a little bit liberally. So we've got to style up. And when we style up, we will produce young men and women who can compete in the digital space, who are capable of competing with the Koreans, competing with the Chinese, competing with the Japanese, competing with the Europeans, competing with the Americans. So let the Tanzanian journalists not tell me that we are better than Kenyan, or Kenyan tell me that we are better than Somalia. Yoweri Kaguta Museveni puts it very well, that how can two dwarfs compete about which one is taller than the other? Even if one dwarf is taller than the other, it's only by an inch, but they are still dwarfs. So we have got to go out into the world and compete with other people who are not dwarfs like us, and we can do it. The mere fact that you've put together this conversation is a good beginning. We are beginning to ask ourselves uncomfortable questions. And history has demonstrated not once, not twice, but times without number, that when our people are capable of asking uncomfortable questions and answering those questions without descending into the arena of insults and abuse, then such a people will begin to rise, because it is out of discomfort that comfort is discovered. So I wish you a good conversation in the knowledge that this generation of journalists is the generation that will be capable of liberating Africa from the chains and manacles of backwardness. Thank you very much.